Hi there and welcome to the Beginner's Handbook. I'm Jordan.
I'm Jamie.
In this episode we're going to be talking about overloading players, or overloading anyone really.
Yeah, so in this episode what we're going to focus on is talking about cognitive overload. Now, for anybody who wonders what that is, that's just the posh way of saying having too much to think about. So dumping a lot of information on players or DMs as well, GMs. We will touch into that a little bit as well, because if you've listened to our previous episodes, you'll know that a lot of what happens in the games, it's not a one-way street. It's not the DM dictating to a player, you know, that it's backwards and forwards, it's collaboration and so on. So we're going to focus mainly on, you know, having too much to think about and too much to process rather than anything else. And you can, believe it or not, physically overload players. If somebody has got, you know, handbooks that you don't have, and you know, you can get them bringing their handbooks. They might have a DM screen, you know, whatever other things are going on. So you can physically overload players as well, in a kind of more literal sense there. But that's, again, we might touch on that a little bit, but the main thing is, you know, giving the players too much to think about.
Yeah, I know someone that's got a hobby bag that literally has packed full of stuff. Like, it's full of dice that he spent probably over £100 on dice for players of his games. He'll hand out dice, gold bags and stuff like that, you know. And usually I remember a couple of the times he tried to give us it at the end of nights and stuff, and like, you look after that. And I was like, no, I've got so many dice, I don't need it. Like, I appreciated the thought, but it became a thing where it became you know, here, take this off of me so I don't need to carry it, but you need to give me it back later. And I was like, well, I don't want it, just you keep it, man.
Yeah.
So literal overload is real, but I don't think it's as big of a problem. I think, speaking of what Jamie's saying there about cognitive overload, it's much easier to do that unknowingly as well. It happens a lot.
Yeah.
I've done it, you know.
Yeah. And again, that will normally happen, or at least from my experience, that will normally happen with an experienced DM or GM who's running a game for newer players. And again, it's not just obviously if you're playing D&D or whatever other RPG you're playing. It happens in all walks of life. The more experience you get with whatever the subject, then the more basic, like the kind of intermediate sort of skill level stuff that you're doing becomes, you know, whether it's, you know, something like gardening or whatever, and you're going, right, okay, well, blueberries like acidic soil or whatever, and something else doesn't, you know, that might eventually become basic for you. But when you've got somebody who's never gardened before, they're looking at you and going, what do you mean acidic soil? I thought it was brown and you put plants in it. What's going on? So, you know, it doesn't matter, whatever the subject. The long and the short is, more experience you gain, the easier it is to forget what it was like being completely brand new to something.
Yeah, I mean, it's something like, I'm coming from outside of this. I do software development, a lot of game development, things like that, and it's very easy. I've been teaching people how to actually learn different programming languages, and even right from the get-go, I was like, I couldn't even talk about printing stuff to console without people's eyes crossing, like, what are you talking about? So it's very, especially if you're experienced. And I think with that in mind, actually, one thing I would like to ask, or we would like to ask anyone listening or watching, we'll start with maybe the players. Have you ever had a time where you felt like, oh my god, that's too much? Whatever that might have been, whether it have been rules, or maybe it was just getting introduced to character creation. That's quite a frequent one that comes up. Let us know about that. How was that resolved, if it was, or did you just have to basically be driven to, or given exposure therapy to it until you get used to building characters? Or as a GM, have you ever been overwhelmed with your players? Overwhelmed, with your players? I have at times, especially when I was newer to running games. I mean, it was going back a while now, but there's certainly times where I've had influxes of messages from like 6 players, you know, different times, and you're sitting going, oh my god. And if you have had something like that, how did that get resolved? Is there something you've done differently that changed how you ran games? Would love to just hear it, because for us, this is just our take on it.
Yeah.
But we want to hear what you actually have to say about it, because it just helps refine our opinion about it as well.
Yeah, because again, like, it's very, very easy to fall in the trap of, you know, kind of nailing your colours to the mast, so to speak, with an opinion, which is, you know, overloading players. It always happens when it's an experienced GM and new players. It's, you know, 90% of the time that's when it happens. It might not be the case. It could, in fact, in thinking about it, it might in fact be more likely to be when you've got a new DM, new GM, and new players, because everybody's new, so they see, you know, they might see something like, you know, somebody who's streamed their game online and that's their kind of first exposure to it, or a source of inspiration, and they see, you know, again, like Jordan was saying, there are different lore elements, or, you know, whatever, and they go, right, I need to make my games like this, so then they kind of overcorrect and put too much in. So let us know what you think. So if you're watching us on YouTube, there's comments underneath, and if you are listening on Spotify or wherever else, then you can let us know through different social media channels that we'll have linked in the description, and we'll have them flashing up every now and then as well. So there's Facebook there, there's Twitter as well, Discord as well, and other places.
Yeah, I think what you said there kind of leads quite well into this next bit, and it's, for me, what I'm interested in kind of talking about, at least at the beginning, is overloading like new players. That's a good place to start, especially I've had quite a bit of experience of needing to teach people the rules of D&D, or recently we were looking at Morkborg, which is a kind of apocalyptic death metal style world. It's super brutal. It's actually dead easy to pick up, but when people are new to it, they're like, what the hell is a goblobbing spit monster or whatever? Like, that's one of the traits you can get in it. But anyway, it seems like it's a lot. They're like, whoa, other than the fact it's just crazy in the head, but especially with games like Pathfinder, I know is mechanically quite difficult, and also I just got the Warhammer Wrath and Glory, which is apparently very, very crunchy. So, and I know it is based on the beginning, I went, oh crap, this looks complicated. So I think then maybe if we start with overloading new players, then have you had experience as a player when you've went, oh my god, this is too much?
Pretty much. See, the first game that we ever played now is, again, for anybody who hasn't actually seen episodes and things previous to this, myself and Jordan, we've been friends for a long time, since school, and however many years ago this was now, our first game of D&D so happened to be with the same group of people. So going back to that first game, I remember it being like that, and again, that might not be surprising that your first game you felt overwhelmed with everything that's going on, because the way that it worked out is we turned up, and, you know, character sheets and things were handed out, and it kind of went over with, and then we started playing from there. So there wasn't really a sort of break-in period to kind of understand the rules, or, you know, basics. It was all kind of, you know, learning on the job, so to speak. So I remember just like the character sheet, looking at it and going, right, so and the thing that confused me the most was skill checks and saving throws. So there was a big huge list of things which then had, in brackets, strength or wisdom or whatever next to it, that had a set of numbers, and then there was a different set of numbers that were to the side in a different box, and, you know, I just remember that being really, really, really confusing, and going, right, I'm not quite getting when I'm supposed to use this box and when I'm supposed to use that box. And then the next thing was, but how come the numbers over there are totally different from the numbers here? You know, and it just was, that was the thing that really seemed to confuse me. Not like attacking with a weapon and things, for whatever reason that made more sense to me. I managed to deal with that, but that's my kind of my overriding memory of it. And then the only other time that the kind of overloading the brain happens is recently in our kind of long campaign that we've been playing, plot element happened, which was it a spell or was it a saving throw? Well, I suppose that would be a spell anyway. So Jordan's character gets hit by this spell.
Oh, that's right.
Which then causes him to have an illusion. So he then starts visualising himself as a wizard. Now, my character is a wizard, so what happened was at that point we had to then swap characters and character sheets and play each other's character. And that was a mind melder at that point, because you're going from a character that you've created, that you know the abilities, that you've worked it out, to all of a sudden having to play somebody else's character now, albeit, you know, I've seen Jordan's character since day one in the game. He's still alive, still going strong. 2
years later, almost. We've probably been saying this for multiple episodes, because I've got no idea where in the timeline it actually. I know it's going to be 2 years if it's not very soon. But anyway, I've had this guy for 2 years.
Yeah, whereas everybody else is, you know, down the tubes the way they've went. So
some of them are killed by me.
yeah, exactly. I wonder who you done that to. So although I know Jordan's character and I roughly know what its abilities are and things because I've seen it in combat as another player, when you're still handed that sheet and you're having to scan it and you have to go, right, well, how many times can I use that ability, which is something we don't know. How many, you know, how quickly does it regenerate, as well as how many times can we use it. Right, okay, I can only use that when I've also done this beforehand, and, you know, all the intricacies you don't know. And then when you then factor in that you're also doing that for a character who's level 8, it's then, you know, however many times you need to assess and analyse and understand quickly on the spot, you're then doing that 8 times for each new kind of ability that appears as the character's leveled up. So even though we've been playing for, you know, years at this point, cognitive overload can still happen.
Do you know what, it's funny because I was surprised. I wasn't as overloaded as I thought I was at the time, so I was thinking about it, and actually I realised quite quick, because I played Wizards. Now, just to give people context that are listening, these characters are level 8, or well, at least, mine's level 9 now because I leveled up. But anyway, Jamie's guy was like level 7 and I'm level 8, so it's not super high, but it's high enough where you get all these race traits, class traits, and all that other stuff.
Yep.
Now we're all dwarfs, so that helps, but I'm an outlier in terms of I'm a Duragar, so there's all this other stuff that comes with it, like magic resistance, light,
sensitivity.
Although we've got goggles for that. But it was nighttime anyway, so it wasn't that big a deal.
Is it not just basically a paper bag that we're putting over your
head? It was pretty much
point?
Someone's underwear. I put glass in or something like that, from what I remember.
Yeah.
But with your guy, it's like, well, I already know the basics of a dwarf, so that's fine. I've got that.
Yeah.
And then I just looked at the prepared spells and noticed that one wasn't prepared, so I asked the GM, can I add one so it's right? He's like, yes. And I went, good. And I added slow, and it really helped until we killed all the guys that had slow quite quick, if I remember right. But yeah, so it wasn't as bad. But I suppose, I mean, so Jamie was playing a barbarian. Now barbarians are like simpler, quote unquote, classes, but the problem is a lot of the stuff's baked into like the information of that character, which maybe isn't on the Roll20 character sheet. Like reckless attack, there is the rage benefits in there, but reckless isn't in there. What that does, the advantage and attacks, but people get advantage on you. There was a Great Weapon Master feat, I had Sentinel, so there's all this other stuff that I've tried to keep the sheet fairly updated just purely for my sake. But there's all this stuff that even any barbarian, it's as a given, it's just part of the class. So it's not like a wizard where all their stuff might be here. And you told me which one of your abilities for your wizard were cool, like potent cantrip and things like that. So I wasn't as it felt a bit easier to have your guy, because it was much more, okay, I know what I can do as a wizard is this stuff, whereas everything you had to do was like, sure, you just need to go and attack, but don't forget the Great Weapon Master. But when someone runs away, use Sentinel so they can't run away. Make sure you're raging, but make sure you hit someone when you're raging, or you'll lose your rage.
Yeah.
So there's all this stuff that poor Jamie had to pick up. Now, thankfully, Jamie survived with 2 hit points, so he done good. He done good. So I would have been raging if he died, Jamie. Not really, but so basically the point is, yes, it can still happen even with experienced players, and this campaign isn't the only one that we've played either, you know.
Yeah.
So the higher the levels go, the harder it gets to keep on top of some new characters.
Yeah, but before we end up drifting off kind of too far, can you think of kind of an example of when it's happened to you again, maybe as a new player, maybe as a more experienced player?
I think as a new player, just to start there, I never had as rough an intro to D&D. I mean, both of Jamie and I's first game of D&D was that game you were talking about, where it was like, what the hell is this? I found D&D a bit kind of like, well, I started off using Call of Cthulhu, and although I found character creation super dull in that, because it's like rolling, it's always points and you're spending points. It's just, I don't find it as fun. But I was kind of used to that, so the idea of making characters, it made sense. I was going, okay, attributes first, the characteristics first, cool, I get that. And I'm like, okay, the skills are kind of like the skills in Cthulhu, except you just, if it's a wisdom based skill, you just add your wisdom. So I could see where some of it was coming from, but I found all these, there's a lot of terminology I found kind of like, this is more to learn, whereas Cthulhu's kind of, it's very real, sort of. So at least I can roleplay an accountant easy, you know. I just need to like money and like counting money. At least that's the character I used. It was an accountant, was like that. So it's dead easy to kind of go, it's a very human thing, a greedy person. Whereas doing, I can't remember, it was a bard, no, or I think it might have been a warlock. That very, very first game,
bard,
I was like an elf or something, you know. So it was all, there's not even just in terms of the sheet, it was even just the whole idea of role playing this character, which at the time I wasn't comfortable with role playing anyway. I just played them like me, but I found it kind of like, I don't know how I'm supposed to act with this guy, because then we're getting told that's not how it would work in the lore. So it was like, oh, I've done the wrong thing, oh my god. So in terms of being a new player, that was maybe one. I think it just, there was a lot of new terms, and I found that probably kind of hard. But as an experienced player, have I ever been overloaded? Not so much. The only time I've had it is when I've had like lore dumps inflicted upon us. Now sometimes lore is important to have, and sometimes you need narrative dumps. Sometimes you just need the expedition, but there's times where I'm given a lot of jargon about religion and the political landscape of some fantasy world, and the guy's taking 15 minutes to talk to us about it, and I've just went, I don't have a clue. Also, what helps with that is my guy's thick as mince, so he doesn't need to know it. So that's my saving grace, and I can hide behind that lie. But
I think you'll find I wasn't not taking notes, I was role-playing.
Yes, I am role-playing, and I should get inspiration for that. But yeah, so that's probably the only real thing for me that I could give an example of.
Yeah, again, that's kind of, it's easily done, getting a lot of lore thrust on you, and it's always kind of trying to find that balance of giving information that then makes the players want to explore and want to find out more about something, and just giving them too much to think about that they end up missing a key element. So it's one of these kind of less is more things, I think, most of the time. I mean, on that subject of overloading your players, I know guys that, like, this is one of the campaigns I've been running for a year from tomorrow, and I think it's to the date as well, or something like that. One of the guys was somebody that joined us a few months ago, but we're trying to finish off this game, and I said, let's not make the guy a character, like, we don't want him to go through the whole, because I know what it's like, you know. Make a character at level 8 please. He'll be like, what? You know, he needs someone there to help him. But I just said to him, well, you can pick one of my guys. And I used the dwarf guy, the barbarian, as a basis for it, because I can just not tell him about all the other stuff. I can just tell him to rage and just take half damage and just swing at everything, and that's it. He doesn't need any more info than that. But he found that quite hard, because it wasn't even just the character aspect. I underestimated the whole setting as someone that's never played before.
who was up for it, I'll add, but it was just like, oh my god, wait, so we've got like 6 different characters here that I need to remember on top of playing it.
Yeah.
So it does happen, but there's ways that we can kind of try and reduce that for new players.
Yeah, and again, that's the thing. There's ways of reducing it, but when you've got a new player there, if you're a new GM or a DM, depending on what game and what system you're playing, the kind of easiest way to think about it is that they will be as confused or more confused than you. They will be as unsure or more unsure than what you are, because chances are what's happened, if you are the DM or the GM, then you've had to put in some research to figure out what the rules are in order to build the world, to build the story. So chances are you've, even if you're both equally as new, you've probably got more experience than that player, because you've physically put in a bit more time than what they have before you start the game. And again, if you're an experienced DM or GM, then try your hardest to remember what it was like the first time that you ever played, and then remember that's exactly what they're going through. And again, like we kind of touched earlier on, it's really, really, really easy as soon as you get a bit of experience and a bit more knowledge, that something that is now basic to you, that you think that it's basic for everyone, rather than, you know, when you're totally brand new, something that's basic is a big step for somebody to learn, rather than something that you can, you know, breeze past without thinking about. So those are the kind of 2 things I'd be thinking about as, or I would say to either a new DM or a more experienced DM.
Yeah, it's interesting coming from the new DM, because I can find, well, starting with experienced DMs, I find sometimes it's just like you're saying, that stuff's taken for granted. And now some people are aware of that, and what they do instead, and I know someone that does this all the time, whereas they'll divulge everything about the game to you right from starting point number 1, and Christ almighty, it's hard work, you know, because it's like you could sit and have someone talk to you for 20 minutes about how the rules work, but as a player, even if you're experienced, I'm like, what? Like, it's dead easy for people to fall into that trap. But for new GMs and DMs, it does make me wonder about how, I mean, like you said, I think going back to what you were saying, everybody's going to be a bit confused, but that's okay. I mean, one thing to do is don't stress out over it, because the thing is, once you do it, you might make mistakes, and if you make mistakes, well, I mean, because you will make them, even if you're experienced, you're going to make them. The best thing you can do when you've made a mistake and figured it out is just apologise for it, or just ding it entirely, because if you've got new players and you're changing the rules is how they might see it, you know, they'll just be like, what? And now that instead of shooting, like, let's say you shoot someone with a spell and you get told, oh, you need to add your ability score modifier to it because it's a leveled spell. This is something that happened recently to ourselves. But it's kind of like, well, I don't think it is, because normally it specifies. But if now we figured that out, you know, just by talking to the guys about it. But if this is a new player, they're going to be like, wait, when do I add it and when don't I? And then it just adds to that complicated nature of it. Yeah, definitely. So yeah.
So when it comes to setting up, you know, a game, and you've got a new player that's there, then the thing that's going to be best for them is to try and to reduce as much of the kind of the thinking as possible for them. Now, that's not us saying that, you know, don't trust them, take everything away from them and just bark orders at them from behind the DM screen as to what to do. That's not what we're saying, that's not what we're advising you to do. But what our kind of warning flag at this point is that there's so much for them to try and learn, that the best thing that you can do is take a bit of the pressure off them. And one of the things that I would say is if you've got more experienced players at the table, then try and utilise them.
Yeah.
So then what it means is that rather than you as the DM, the person that's organising it, the person that's story, the person that's keeping the rules, rather than you telling them do this, or however it ends up happening, where that person then might think, oh, I'm slowing the game down, or oh, I'm getting told this because I'm doing something wrong, or they start potentially reading into that situation the wrong way. If you've got an experienced player there who can lean over and guide them and keep them right and kind of get them explaining what they want to do to that player, so that then when the time comes for them to roll in combat or explore something and do a skill check, they've got that player there to give them a nudge, give them a hint, or there's downtime and the DM is talking to somebody else, that player at the side can go, right, okay, this is how it works, and take a couple of minutes out to explain something, keeps the story moving, keeps things ticking along, and ultimately it's getting that person integrated as quickly as possible. So then again, the DM's talking to somebody else, you've got that experienced player there explaining bits and pieces, answering questions, and then when the DM's interacting with that new player, then the same thing's going to be happening anyway, so you're keeping them involved for as much as possible as well. Because a new player, the other thing as well is that when they're sitting there waiting for their turn, again, I think most people will get that you need to have some form of order, otherwise it becomes chaos and a shouting match and nothing happens. But when they're new and they're sitting there and somebody's talking and they've got no idea what's happening, then they're probably going to feel a bit isolated at that point. So again, that experienced player being there can, by just talking to them and explaining what's going on, going, oh, right, okay, he's asked if he can open that door, but it's locked, so he's trying to put his shoulder through it and open it. So what's happening now is he's using a skill check, so that's to see whether he can do it, and blah blah blah, whatever. It keeps engagement, and I think that's probably going to be crucial for new players as well.
I actually like that a lot, because I've done that before with some of the guys. Like tomorrow, this is talking about DM overload. Tomorrow I'm going to have 9 people at this game. It's a big finale of this game that I've been doing for like a year, and there's normally about 6 people. Normally, sometimes 7, depending on who can make it. But there's now 2 completely new guys that were invited over. So I've said to them, don't worry about making characters. You don't need to play. Basically, you can if you want, and I'll give you guys, because I'm sitting going, oh my god, I've got so many NPCs right now, and I've got like 3 of them that I've got stats, so I'm like, I could just give them the stats. But if they were playing, actually, it's a good thing, and I've used it before and it worked, where if someone who's maybe a bit more experienced, they don't need to be an expert by any means, but if they know the basics of what's happening, like skill checks, fine. And that's pretty much all you need to know as a player, and the GM will tell you the rest. But that can kind of help that player learn as they go. One thing that I've also noticed that can help anyone really, or anyone new to any system, is just kind of encouraging them just to rely on the DM or GM to basically support them through whatever they're doing. So, because the GM's the person that's going to be directing the story, and then they'll be the ones asking for checks, or they'll say what you're going to do, and then that's when you throw the ball over to the player's side. And then if they ask to do stuff, then at that point you ask them for a check, and if they're new, you just explain what that means to them. So there's ways as a GM that you can help your players a bit. And I've found I've never actually done one yet, although I've kind of done it through text. But I find what can help reduce that overload a bit, because you're going to have it regardless, and that's doing like a proper session 0, whereas you can help people figure out their guys, and it's just spend the night going through the whole character creation and just do it slow, get a few drinks in, get some grub, and just have fun and spend the whole night making characters. I found that helps people kind of when they play it for the first time, they're like, okay, so I know where to look on the sheet for this, or my hit points, or my ammo, whatever game you're playing.
Yeah, and I think the thing, like, kind of mentioned there as well, is that if you are getting people around to do that, then don't let them think that there's kind of a lot of game elements that are going to be happening, because then when they turn up and they sit around and all they've done is write stuff on a bit of paper and nothing's actually happened, then it's, you know, they can feel a bit deflated at that point. Whereas if you get them round for doing it, you know, part social, part preparation, and explain it like that, like, there's a lot of kind of footery wee bits and pieces that we'll need to do. So what we'll do is we'll all just catch up, hang out, do this, and then we'll get that done. As well as, again, I think that's probably the best way of explaining it to whoever you've got there, rather than explaining it as being part of the game. And even things as well, like with us, with the podcast, we even done an episode 0.
Yeah, that's true.
We took that same concept just to let people kind of get a bit of insight with us before we started, you know, rambling on in front of a microphone, just so that people beforehand could figure out whether that, you know, I suppose whether they trusted us to give advice or not, I suppose. But that's probably the way I would think about it and the way I would explain it to somebody. Yeah,
I'm thinking for the first game, I'm going to be running a workboard game with a few guys, and it's an easier system to make characters for, but I'm going to do the whole session 0 thing and just do everything at the same time with folk, make everyone do their hit points first and everyone get their weapons, because then it means by the time you've done that 4 times and everyone's involved in it, they can have fun making characters with each other. So in some sense, they're all making multiple characters for that one session. But I also find one way, and I do this a lot just because of experience, but I guess I've probably picked it up from different players that I've watched, different GMs that I've watched and been involved with. But if you can make mechanical things of the game baked into narrative, then people have that connection for it, you know. So it's almost like anchors for certain actions. Like, okay, if you ask somebody what do you want to do and they say, I want to search for that, you can say, so you're searching through it and blah blah blah. While you're searching through it, you know, and then ask for the check. So then they go, okay, so they can start to make the connections. So even if it's only that they've learned how to do a perception check, then at that point they know how to do an ability check or a skill check, and now they know how to do them all. It's just what determines what that ability is the GM, basically. But narrative can really help. I mean, I say that all the time though, but I think it's true. If it makes sense to them, like if they can imagine it, which is why I think Cthulhu characters tend to be easier, well, at least in my experience, to get people into. While the creation's a bit boring, playing the characters is quite easy for folk, and it's because it's dead easy to imagine it, you know. Whereas it can be a bit different if you're playing a dwarf, a purple dwarf that's never came out of the Underdark in his life, you know. Now he also loves gold and things, and he's obsessed with stone. I mean, if I was to roleplay that guy for the first time, I'd have no idea what the hell I was supposed to say at any given period. Forgetting the fact I couldn't see, but I suppose as somebody that wears glasses, it's probably part. I can relate to it to some degree. But
yeah, and again, just kind of this is something that's popped into my head as well, that for DMs and GMs, kind of more in particular here, your short-term memory, you can only remember, and again this is approximate because everybody's different and some people have got, you know, better memories than other people, but in general across the board, your short-term memory, you can only remember 7 things in plus or minus 2. So if you have, you know, whatever lore elements you're introducing on top of a player that's trying to remember rules, and on top of, you know, whatever else, you can see how quickly that is the short-term memory is going to get swamped. And if you've got a player that's a bit more experienced in things, then okay, it's freeing up some space. But remember, even with an experienced player, it's 7 things plus or minus 2. So that could actually be up to 5 things that person can remember. So if again, obviously you don't need to remember that one fact there, and again, if I've got the numbers right, I'm pretty sure I have, but the long and the short from that is that your short-term memory is probably a lot smaller than you think it is. So bear that in mind. People can only keep a handful of new things in their head at any given time until they've committed it to the long-term memory. So again, like we were saying earlier on, if in doubt, less is probably more.
Yeah, it's the old Michael Scott KISS method, which is keep it simple, stupid. You just make it as easy as possible for people, because now, like you're saying, if you're a very experienced GM, there's the risk where you kind of divulge it. So, some of the stuff I do quite a lot is when I ask people to do stuff or ask for certain roles, I don't explain why that role has been made up and why they need to do certain things. I bake that into the narrative so they understand inherently what the why is. So it saves another thing that they need to go, okay, and try and figure out. Some people like working out mechanics, that's fine. But I find for the most part, people will figure them out fine as long as it's baked into the kind of story elements that they're approaching. It's certainly something with the new players tomorrow that I'll be seeing. Good luck to the poor guys. We're all at level 9. It's going to be wild, and they're going to be picking up 2 completely new characters. But I've said to them it's okay though. They don't need to worry about it. And if they get stuck, you've got like 6 other players.
Yeah, who can pitch in.
Yeah. There's probably 5 that are really good. And there's another 1 or 2 that will be
there.
Well, it's just in terms of how long they've played a bit less. Now they might be better than me. They could be much better than me. Who knows? But I just know that the guys that have been playing originally, it was originally 3 other people, and that became kind of 4. And they've been playing for like a whole year, almost most weeks, averaging maybe 3 times a month. So. They're good and they'll be great for the 2 new guys. There's always going to be someone to support them. And if they get stuck, well, I'll just be nice to them and I'll kill them later in the game and not earlier.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we should talk about as well is the kind of things that will overload players. And I think one of the biggest danger areas is homebrew content. If you look at, say, a class, then again, if we pick like the wizard class and we go for the evocation wizard, then you go, right, well, that is something that you can find in the player's handbook. It's also something that you can find on like D&D Beyond, as an example, as one of the kind of sort of free classes that are listed there. So it's information that is, it's already out there. It's not something that's new to you, your players, or your fellow players, depending on what side of the fence you are. And it's not something that is completely unique. And because of that, even if it's not a class that you've played before and you start playing it, chances are you've seen it, even if it's just you've skimmed over it or it's subconsciously in the back of your head somewhere, then there's still a chance that you have some familiarity with it, and if you don't, there's a chance that somebody else at the table has some form of familiarity with it, so that if you do find yourself getting bogged down, somebody's there to help you out. Whereas if it's something that's homebrewed, then it's only the person who's created it and the person who is supposed to be playing it. They're the only people that will have seen that. And again, depending on how your table is, there might be other people there that have also looked at it out of interest or, whatever other situation it is. But chances are it's just going to be the player and the GM that have looked at that, have seen that and know what's going on, which again is potentially a kind of danger area for getting bogged down.
Yeah, there's kind of homebrew rules that you can make. There's plenty online, but there's the rules themselves tend to not be so bad, because it might be like crunchy criticals where you do max damage plus the reroll, whereas normally the way criticals I think works, you double the damage die. So
well, that's the way that we've done it. So basically,
no, when I say double damage die, I mean you literally roll 4 instead of 2 if it's a 2. 2d6, you roll 4d6. But the way we do it is we roll just the damage dice
and then
with
double.
the modifiers, but it's just the result of the first set of damage dice with double. And that's just to give us that better average, really. But the crunchy crit one, I actually love it because it makes criticals much more brutal, although I hate it when the paladin uses it because the guy just won't quit with those divine smites, god damn it. But I mean, it's like the power of the sun he just unleashes on every character he fights. But so we actually do its max damage for the do whatever your attack would be maximum, and then you re-roll all the damage dice, so it's even more dangerous. But we done that because we wanted to have nice cool homebrew rule that made everyone much more lethal, including to them, because combat's taking way too long at level 9 or 8 at the time, but now 9. But so the rules themselves don't tend to be as hard. It's just worth remembering that if you've got an experienced player, when you introduce a homebrew rule, like maybe it's crunchy crits you're using, or maybe you want like the strongholds and followers set of rules for short and long rests. I mean, short rest is 8 hours, long rest is a week, I think. Is that right? Might be mixing that up.
Yeah, basically. So rather than a short rest being a break during the day, and then a long rest being, sleeping at night, it kind of takes those two rest periods and it kind of forwards them on to the sort of the next longest period. So in other words, your short rest is a day and your long rest is the week. Is a
whole week.
Yeah,
and that's fine, but it's like, as somebody that, if you're experienced, you might forget that, so it's worth bearing that in mind if you do introduce different homebrew rules. Just make sure if anyone's familiar with the rules that at least remind them, because they might forget,
and again, something that I never really thought about until you started saying there is that if you've got a new player who then goes away and does research and then comes back, could end up even more confused because they're reading in the official rules that
that's not what it is.
A long rest is 8 hours sleep, and that you're telling them no, it's a week.
4 hours for my elf who well, I don't know how that works in strongholds and followers. It doesn't tell us. I don't know, I've not read the book, but
I've not read that one either, but
it suggests it's half the time, so what is it, 3.5 days or something? But that's the thing though, but the rules themselves tend to be a bit easier to manage, at least, especially if you tell people up front. Like I introduced to some of the guys, I said, look, I'm going to change how the healing works, the potions, just because some of them are getting mixed up, because it does say it's an action for a healing potion. I said, we're doing that as a bonus action, that's for number 1. Number 2 is, as long as you've got the action to do a spell, you can do more than one spell in a turn, because there's no sorcerers about, and their whole thing's getting quick and casting. So I just thought, well, if you've got a spell as an action and you've got one that you can use as a bonus action, you can use them both. Screw it. That's totally fine, because half the time you end up with these guys that are super drunk that can't remember, so I need to babysit them sometimes. So I just, or one person in particular, but I just and I used to get a lot of arguing from that particular player, and I just went, that's just not how it works, buddy. But I thought, well, I get his point. He wants to be super cool, and it's D&D, it's a bit power fantasy, so I just said up front, that's how we're going to do it now, and everyone's on board with it. So just be super clear with the rules. I think where homebrew becomes a bit more, I don't want to say dangerous, because that sounds super dramatic, but it's when you're homebrewing custom classes and stuff like that, because we've had something recent. Now, we've not had the issue, but we know it sounded really cool, so a couple of the guys we play with have made a custom class for our pal who's playing with us, and the guy who's also our pal that's running it, they made a class, or I think what happened was that, as far as I'm aware, the DM made the class, and then the player and that, they kind of worked a wee bit on it and done it, but because it was kind of, I think, fairly fast turnaround and things, and there was a lot of mechanical things they tried to do with it, and it made it super complicated from what I understand, at least hearing from the player. It was maybe a bit too much. That's not like anyone's fault, it's going to happen sometimes with homebrew, so
and just teething issues and things.
So it's worth just bearing in mind that classes and kind of super mechanically heavy stuff, it's worth just being a bit more careful with. Combat, to be honest, that would maybe fall under the rules. Combat can be super overwhelming for new players, but if you're adding custom homebrew stuff to the combat, be careful. Speaking about the guy with a custom class, one of our guys, the guy that was DMing it, he introduced bleeding, and actually it wasn't a super complicated homebrew rule, as far as I know it's homebrew, but I actually think it's cool, and it adds a lot. You just take extra damage per turn when you're bleeding, that's it. It's a bleed status effect, and everybody's familiar with that, so it's a cool wee homebrew rule, super easy, and appended onto combat. But the class itself was like super overpowered from what I remember, but it was also like very unclear, I think, how like progression and what traits you get. It seemed pretty hard work. So if you are introducing it, just be careful. I wouldn't recommend it, to be honest, unless you've got experienced players, because you've got classes for a reason. Oh, one thing to reduce overload as well, by the way, I might be jumping back a bit, tell players to not multi-class, because I've made that mistake, and they always complain about why they don't get feats at certain times, and it's because of multi-class. So it's just, I always find it better when people can get several games of not multi-classing, so they feel comfortable before the multi-class. Multi-classing's fun, but as an experienced player, I've never been interested. I've done it once, and to be honest, I've had as much fun as I've had with standard classes. You know, maybe not standard, but just like one class like I've stuck to for my levels. Just that's one thing to do, because I know that I had players arguing about stuff with each other, about what stuff they all get, and because they all multi-class, they all had it wrong. You know, just the poor guys. But then that was maybe up to me to manage that a bit better when I know this was completely new players at the time. But anyway, so I think that's maybe some of the stuff for me when it comes to homebrew. I think just generally other things that can overload your players is things like, we've spoken about the lore already.
Yeah.
One thing, I'm pretty big on this, mostly because I think long combat's really boring. But that's my controversial opinion with it. I know you can do things to make it interesting, but there's only so long that you can make combat interesting before people are fatigued with it. For me, like, if combat, there's too many things happening in combat, it can really screw up players and get them confused. You're better modularising sections, keeping people in their boxes and introducing back. Instead of having 50 bad guys, have 10 and maybe introduce 5 more later on as the fight goes on. You know, there's ways that you can put it in stages to make it easier for people. But I also find lore's a big one, which I mentioned already, but even roleplay segments can be a bit much. You see, if you've got new players, maybe not even new players like to the game, but maybe it's new players to your group, they might not be that comfortable role playing. So and I know it maybe isn't technically overloading, but when you've got people getting hit with all these different stimulus, if it is a completely new player, they've got new rules, then now they're seeing other people do voices. You know, they need to know answers to questions that they've never, like, I've personally had people ask me questions, GMs ask me questions about lore based stuff, about the environment and the political status of the continent we're in. I'm just like, I have no idea what you're talking about, and it's like, I should know. What should I though? Because I can't remember. Normally what happens though is if that's something that I was told 7 months ago, I'm not going to remember. So it's just worth keeping all that in mind, that you can get too much of just about everything if you're not careful. Now it's harder to make things too much, like certain things like having too much lore's easy to figure out when you've got too much. That's if people say what at the end of what you've just said, or they can't remember a damn thing, or they just look bored. Normally that's a bit much at that point. But there's other things like going back to the homebrew stuff's important just to be careful with, and make sure that you need to make sure it's clear before you introduce it in your players, but make sure you signpost it, I would say, is the main thing with anything homebrew. Just make sure people know that they know it's not a standard rule. That saves the new players getting confused, and it lets the experienced players know that this is something a wee bit different for our game.
And again, talking about lore, I think that's the biggest danger area out of everything. Maybe the actual rules themselves are a kind of a close second, but I think lore's probably the biggest and the easiest trap to fall into, you know, overloading players, because again, if you've got a new player and you're giving them elements of lore, they've not quite at that stage figured out, you know, they've not figured out what is context, what's explanation, and what is important that needs to be remembered and carried on and through. If you're a bit more experienced, then you've got a better idea of that. But the flip side of that is that if somebody has came up with a world and it's complicated and there's a lot of political stuff going on and whatever else is happening in that world, because they've came up with it, then the danger is that because they know every single micro fragment of that they give you every single piece of it, which then just swamps you with information and you end up confused and not really going anywhere.
That's probably the thing that I get kind of switched off with quite a lot. Not quite a lot as if it happens all the time, but I think the thing that's probably the most frequent thing to kind of overload me is lore, and you get people doing monologues, especially like when you've got names with like 8 syllables in it, and like every NPC's got various titles that they have to say every time they talk. I'm just like, I'm already like, whoa, this is too much for me.
Yep.
Is that the big ugly guy that doesn't like us? That's all I need to know, you know. But I think that kind of leads into kind of how do you kind of reduce that overall, and I think just to kind of summarise it all before we go into the details, I think probably introducing stuff as and when it's needed is like my mentality for all of this. That's it. The rules is a good example. You said it's maybe a close second for like with the lore.
Mm-hmm.
I find actually I agree, but I also find rules are one of the easiest things to kind of help people through, as long as you're introducing things when they're needed, because it is one of the things that's like lore. It's like using sanity in Cthulhu. People go, oh my god, and they try and read it in the handbook and they're like, I don't have a bloody clue what that's saying. Indefinite insanity, temporary insanity, underlying insanity, permanent insanity. It's like, what? There's all these terms for basically what people would think is the one thing. So like it's the same with D&D with different things like combat. You get a bonus action movement, and that's about it. But if you've got action surge, you get another action. But your attack action gets 2 attacks in it sometimes when you get to a high enough level. But you can't do 2 fireballs in that time, you know. So there's all these things, but if you introduce stuff when people need them, that keeps it super simple. Lore's, I think the reason lore and kind of information dumps of any type, whether it's lore or expedition or anything else, they're the hardest ones to maybe get right, whereas rules is certainly one that overwhelms people, but I find introducing it slowly is fine. Narratively introducing stuff's fine too. Lore can be introduced narratively, that's how you deliver it, but sometimes people need certain key information, but how do you give them it without it being a big dump? So I find that one the trickiest. Now I have less of an issue with that in my games, mostly because I don't do big dumps like that, because I barely have enough time to prep stuff that takes me 20 minutes solo monologue. I don't do it anyway. And I find half the time people don't even see it, because they're away fighting things and doing the wrong quote unquote thing that's not in my railroad, which is another episode that you should listen to. But I just don't worry too much about a lot of the lore stuff, because it will come out later. I don't need to give people dumps. They'll find it out as they need it, and if they don't ask questions about things, then they wouldn't get it anyway. So
again, I think you're right, and I again 100% agree that there is no point talking about something until the player needs it. Don't get me wrong, if you are out of game and you're at a session 0, or it's at the end of a game, or it's at the start of a game, and you're getting set up or whatever, and if they're asking questions, fine, okay, talk about whatever it is, no bother at all, because as soon as the game starts, you're just focused on the game itself and working your way through the story. So again, especially with new players, I don't think you gain anything from just giving them a load of stuff that they're going to need in 5 minutes time, because in 5 minutes time they've already forgotten what it is. So until they're familiar with it, until they've learned it, until they've committed it to the long-term memory, then you will need to remind them anyway. So save yourself the time, save yourself the stress, save them the stress, and only explain it as and when they need it. So I think you're totally right with that.
As a GM, I can't flame and remember what players have done 5 minutes after the fact. It's usually I'm going, okay, wait, what made this fight happen again? I mean, it's dead easy for people to do. So I think even talking about just keeping it simple for people, I've already mentioned that. and we've already spoke about kind of introducing stuff as and when. Like, I think I was saying one of the big offenders is the homebrewing things, and I think really the easy way around that is we've spoke about signposting it when you're using it, but if you're doing a class, you're probably better actually building it with the person that you're trying to make the class for in the first place to make sure it makes sense as you're building it. Now, I mean, I don't know, maybe the guy that we're using as the example for that, he might have done that. We don't know, we just know it was complicated. So it's worth just bear that in mind. Like, if I was going to introduce a new spell that had like 3 different effects, I would say ask the player, does this make sense? If I was homebrewing a spell, you know.
I think for context I'm not 100% sure, so I hope I don't get an angry comment underneath from like a mysterious account that appears and is only ever going to make that one comment. But
it's me.
I think what happened in that case was the DM had the class getting kind of made in the background, and things were getting thought about and added and subtracted.
Right, okay.
Then the death of the other player happened in the campaign, which then led that character to kind of get triggered and to get sped up.
Okay.
And I think it then got fired in and ready for the game, maybe slightly ahead of its natural schedule.
Right.
But the player, as far as I know, had no input into the class. As far as I know.
Yeah.
It was completely of the DM's creation.
The thing is though, like, we're not saying don't do that. You know, that's not, I mean, but go ahead and do it. It's just worth bearing. The thing is, if you're experienced in a class, no matter how confusing it is, they'll be able to handle it in the middle of a game. So it's just worth just think about, especially newer players, with things like these new custom classes if you want to make your own homebrew, because it's just, especially new people, it's dead easy to throw them off their kind of balance a bit. And it's not their fault. Role-playing games, there's a lot to them. That's why the rulebooks cost £35 minimum half the time.
Yeah.
And you can get hundreds of hours that are just one book. You know, it's because there's enough content there for that. So just bear that in mind.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, like, talking about that, these things that end up being produced as official manuals, before that gets published, the person writes everything down, they come up with, you know, the idea, or the team of people come up with the idea, then gets submitted to a publisher who then sits and reads through it and then decides what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, sends that manuscript back with, you know, pen mark corrections all over it, and then, you know, that process happens however many times until it's deemed passable and ready for publication. So when you've came up with your own homebrewed class, you need to also remember that, you know, have you had that same editorial process? So you either need to be tough with yourself and be neutral as you're working your way through it, and sit and ask yourself, does that make sense compared to other classes? Does this seem, you know, ridiculously overpowered or whatever? Is it balanced? And, you know, ask yourself those questions. And if you're fortunate enough to have other experienced players or DMs around you, give it to them, let them have a look, let them see, and then get that feedback from them. And again, if you're going to introduce it to your games, going back to a point we made earlier on, chances are it's less is more. It's easier to add something to it to balance it out than to look at a list of 20 things and then go, right, which one of these am I going to remove? Which one?
Yeah, I think actually on that note as well, though, I mean, the thing is, like, they're talking about the editorial stuff, and that's fine, but one of these things that all of these games do, and a lot of them actually have printed in the books, maybe other than D&D, I don't know, because they don't print it in there as far as I know, but it's playtest stuff. So if you do want to do a wee custom class, that's totally fine. Even if it's new players, it's fine. You just need to be wary of them. But if you are going to do a custom class, don't make it something that's just set in stone. Make it something that if it is super overpowered or just crap as a class, make it clear to, like, if I was doing a custom class with Jamie right now in a game we're doing tomorrow night, he's going to be some guy that's going to save the world for whatever reason. You know, I wanted to make a cool new class that kind of took some features of all these different classes, but it was its own thing, whatever we want to call it. The tracker, which is like a ranger, but he's got well, I suppose rangers have all that, but you get my point.
The chameleon class.
Yeah, basically
taking one element from every other class.
We could do that and try it, and if it doesn't work, then we can always adjust stuff, just tweak it post. I mean, that's fine too. There's nothing wrong with all the homebrew stuff. It's just, especially with kind of things that get more complicated, it's worth just saying we'll try it for a bit. Even with the crunchy crit rule that I've used for my games, I said let's see how it goes. Not because I was worried about me dying. If they're using it, I'm using it. That's I make sure it's kind of equal that way. So I'm like, I don't want to one-shot these guys, like, because it's very easy to kill players as a DM. Like, it's not that hard at all. But when you've got crunchy crits on it, oh my god! Like, I could, even with a well-balanced game, which I think I'm reasonable at doing, you know, because a lot of the recent fights have been super to the bone. But if I had a crunchy crit, I could have been killing players. Like, so there was one game I critted 4 times in one fight. That could have been easily at least 2 of them dead out of the 6, you know. So, and once players start to lose their numbers, it's much more likely the rest of them will die. So it's just never hold yourself to a homebrew. Don't feel bad if you want to take it out or tweak it. It's totally okay, and that will it might give players a bit of overload, but ultimately they'll figure that out quick enough. Just keep it consistent, really. Once you stick to it, or once you decide on it, stick to it until a point where you don't want it. And just keep that messaging clear to your players. I think that's really the main thing. It goes back to communication, which we've said a million times.
Yeah, that's the thing. And again, with homebrew classes, it can even overload an experienced player because it's something that's unique. There isn't reference to it other than at your table. You know, it's nothing that's subconsciously in the back of their mind. It's nothing that they've ever played before, like 4 years ago, or, you know, whatever. So they have to know everything about it instantly. And if you're, you know, chucking them in at, you know, 5th level plus, then they're going to have a lot of juggling to do, and it's, you know, potentially going to impact in the wider elements of the game, such as, you know, like role playing or whatever else, or even just their enjoyment because they're sitting spending half an hour studying a character sheet and supporting material, whatever that so happens to be, rather than just getting on and playing it straight away. And again, I just would not recommend the homebrew for somebody who's completely new, unless it's been tried, it's been tested, and it's, you know, and it's solid. If it's something that's new and homebrewed, I would keep that in the back burner for some way down the line. Yeah,
I think that's something that I think what's good or is important to do. I think the easiest way to avoid overloading folk is just being able to read the room. You know, because it'll be clear when people are confused. I mean, there's people I know that still have been playing D&D for like months and they still don't know what their spell save DC is. Now, the reason for that is because it's probably never overtly. Now, they know now, but I mean, well, I suppose it was only up until recently. But they didn't know. They knew what the number was for a while, and then they didn't play it, and then they forgot where to find it. But all they needed to know is it's like 8 plus proficiency plus the spell casting modifier. That's like, well, that's a lot. But, you know, once they figured that bit out, they're like, okay, so even if I don't know it, it's like they know how to figure it out now. And that's somebody that's been playing for a long time. But, you know, it was clear during moments where I'm asking what's the DC, freeze, okay, what's happening there, okay, and then just walk through it with them and they'll eventually get it. But being able to read the room will stop. You're going to, what I mean is you're going to overload people at some point, and it's going to happen, and it's going to continue to happen. But as long as you can just read the room a bit, as long as not everyone at the table is totally lost, you know, then you're probably doing fine. It's just maybe 1 or 2 things, and eventually you'll have very little overloading going on. And I mean, ultimately as well, it's a kind of balance between, or not a balance between, that's not what I mean. There is a difference between
putting a challenge in front of somebody and overloading them. If you've given them different pieces of information and you're then asking them to recall something and they can't do it, that's you overloaded them. But if you want the person to be confused in a situation in order to make their character unsure and so on, then yeah, okay, you can give them lots of information to create that kind of smoke screen. But if it's something that you want them to recall and you need them to recall, then be very careful about how much you're giving them. Whereas if it's, again, you're trying to create that trap, so to speak, then fire away.
Yeah, I think that kind of leads us kind of right on to, for me anyway, the last point, which is the overloading your GM, or at least communicating that to them as well. I think, I know we've touched on it recently, but GMs can be overloaded. And sometimes that's how players end up getting overloaded, because it's like, well, we spoke about new GMs at the start and how, it's easy for them to kind of, well, I'll start with experienced ones. Who experienced GMs might basically relay everything, like total brain dump everything onto players. I mean, new GMs will do that too, but sometimes it's conflicting rules and stuff. I've seen that a lot. It happens, it's going to happen. But you can actually, as players, you can overload your own GM. It definitely happens. For me, I get it sometimes if people want to make characters, and I'll get literally my phone red hot all day, especially with a group of like 9. I've had a lot of messages about that today. Even for this episode, I've muted everything because I know I've got a bunch of messages waiting there. Like, what character can they play? Can you give them? Can you put them at level 15 to see what it's like? I'm like, just stop, please, just stop. And what they don't realise is they're already going to meet like 7 significant NPCs, and there's now 2 new players. So there's going to be a lot going on in that game. So just I bring that up more because sometimes just think of your GM as well. If you want to do cool custom stuff, that's cool, and ask them for it. But be there to support them if they want. If they might want you to sit down and do a custom multi-class, a homebrew class. Yeah. Or if your GM says, please, because this is our first game, don't multi-class. Just maybe you can ask why. That's not a problem. But maybe just heed them for that time, because maybe they're not comfortable with the multi-class. Maybe they've not figured that out yet. Because that was the case for me. I've never multi-classed, and I had 3 players multi-classing like immediately. No, sorry, 2 of them did, and the third guy didn't. He was the only guy that listened. Turns out he had the strongest character for a long time, because the other 2 were catching up because their levels were like all funny. Because
it becomes a jack of all trades, master of none.
One of the guys was like, how come I don't get 2 attacks a turn? It's like, because you're level 5 and you've multi-classed twice, so...
So realistically the highest level that you are is a level 3 character.
So it's just one of these things. So it's more just be aware of that, I think, more than anything else, because it does happen. And sometimes, especially, I know people, there's a guy I know that he takes a month to run any game. He wants a month of prep. I don't know what that guy's doing, but he's putting himself through a lot of
torture.
A lot of just brain gymnastics to get through even a small session, So he funnily enough, weirdly, he tends to get very stressed out during games when people don't do things that he wants them to do. But it's because he takes all that time, precious effort into things that I don't get it so much. But anyway, just keep that in mind with your GMs. I mean, most of them will probably be fine, and if they didn't want you to do it, they'll probably just say no. And that's fine, but just respect that though, because they're just trying to run a game for you as well.
And again, if you just a kind of point to flag up as well, if you are a player and you are feeling that the pace is moving at a point that it's too fast and that you're struggling to kind of remember things, or whatever the particular situation is that's making you feel uncomfortable or on the back foot, or that you're missing pieces of information, just flag that up to your DM, because again, nobody wants somebody to be sitting there feeling on the outside, or whatever the situation is. So flag that up to them And again, you need to kind of judge each situation for yourself. If you feel that you're only 10 minutes into the game but you're already feeling that you've totally lost what's happening, right, stick your hand up, like, ask a question, whatever, like, get it sorted there and then. If you're roughly keeping up but the kind of lower elements are confusing you a little bit, then wait until after the game, wait till out the game, and then talk to the DM at that point and go, look, I'm confused about this element, seek clarification, or ask them that when it's lower elements, if that's what's tripping you up a bit more, just to kind of take a little bit more time there, or whatever you feel you need in order to get the kind of fullest experience from it. Again, don't panic about that, don't freak out about that, because communication, like Jordan said earlier on, it's a big thing that the two of us will talk about in practically every episode, because strangely enough it's really, really important, and 99.9% of the issues that will ever come up in D&D, and again in the wider world as well, is normally through either a lack of communication or poor communication, or whatever kind of combination of those two things. And if things were just clarified and talked about properly without anybody panicking about what somebody else thinks, or whatever else it is, most of the situations that occur would never occur.
Yeah, it's being able to have that conversation is important, because one of the games I had at the local comic shop, the guy, it was a new kind of DM, he's played games before, not D&D until he started playing with us, but that's only been a few months, I think. So this was his first set of running games, and he'd had this very elaborate scheme, and he already shot himself in the foot by the start of it, because not that there was a big issue with it or anything, it's just more like, I knew as soon as the guy started talking about what he wanted us to do, I went, he's going to have a hell of a time trying to organise that, because not only does he know that that's not the stuff that we do, we kill people and we're good at it, but now he wants to remove our weapons and go to a wedding. But he wanted to have this elaborate puzzle thing going on, and I actually liked the concept a lot.
Yeah.
But the problem was the guy put himself in knots, like trying to figure out how the hell it was going to unfold, and it wasn't going to unfold the way he wanted it, because it just wasn't going to. And then in the middle of the game, the guy had overloaded himself, and be aware of that. Like, mate, don't overload yourself as a DM. I go into games with like 3 bullet points. Now, I've done a lot and I'm good at improvising things, and I've usually get the background enough to tie things in. But this guy had a script almost in front of him, on his screen. But and the guy, I mean, not only did he put himself in knots and get super stressed, because it's a comic shop, he couldn't quite hear sometimes. He would misinterpret or just forget stuff. And I mean, I said to him, I kind of just said, like, during one of the breaks, I just said he screwed up one of my guy's stuff, and he wanted to throw him in jail and stuff for things that it didn't make sense, because he didn't understand me properly. But I just said, don't worry, but just leave it, that's fine. Don't bother retconning it, I'll just go in jail, because I get it, it's definitely worth just be careful. Don't overload yourself as a player or GM. As a player, don't go and read 50 different character classes and expect that you need to know that yourself when you're starting a new game. Just read the class that you need. Like we said earlier, exactly. as a GM, tell the players what they need when they need to know it. And as a player, research the stuff when you need to look into it. If you want to do it for interest, that's fine, but don't feel obligated to need to know everything when you go in. I'd say that's a really big one. I would just say, just keep that conversation going. Really, like we spoke about, if you get stuck, talk to your DM if you're feeling not left behind, but maybe you're falling behind with things, or maybe it's moving too fast. Not the same thing exactly, but just an example of communicating. Like, we're doing a hardcore game, like 8 hours for a short rest, a week for a long rest, and that's annoying, because all my good stuff is a long rest, and as a barbarian, my bread and butter is rage, which is only long rest, and we've literally had nothing but fights for like the last 4 games. It's a pain in the ass, because that's not what I want to do. But that's just the way things have unfolded.
Yep.
And I said to the guy, hey, look, now while this isn't overloading, although I was aware that I don't want to throw a lot of stuff at the guy, so I said to him, look, I would quite like, I've seen this homebrew rule before, and I think it'd be cool, where if, like, I've seen it for spellcasters, if you've got no spell slots, you can give yourself exhaustion, meaning there's effects to exhaustion. I won't go into it now, but effectively there's bad stuff that happens when you get exhausted. So if there's, I've seen online that if a spellcaster shoots a spell with no, they can still basically cast without a spell slot, but if they do that, they get exhaustion, and it compounds. So if you've got a level 5 spell and you cast it and you've got no spell slots, you'll get 5 exhaustion. So you wouldn't do that because that's like going to kill you.
Yeah.
So I said, I've heard that's cool, but I'd like to do something with my rage. Like there might be barbarian class tree stuff for that. I know you can get on relentless rage or something, but I said, but it would be cool for me to rage. Like, I'm out of rage, and now if I rage again, I become exhausted. I get level 1 exhaustion. And if I rage again, it's now level 2, and it kind of starts to build up. He went, go ahead. I was like, cool. Because otherwise I'd be sitting going, I don't want to get in any fights now. Whereas now I've got a bit of risk reward for doing it.
Yeah.
So it's pretty cool. But while that's not overloading or to do with overloading or cognitive overload at all, it's an example of talking to somebody and just...
Yeah, but also on the kind of flip side of that, it could potentially be an example of overloading, because if you'd done that in the middle of, like you were saying, if there was a fight that the DM's managing, like, again, just picking a figure, like 20 different enemy characters,
well, yeah,
as well
I
as...
had 20 characters
yeah,
in
as
game.
well as figuring out what you guys are doing as you are playing and going through the turn order and making sure nobody's been missed, and there might be a lot of things like that going on, and then if you pop up with this question
in the middle of a turn, let's say that's not yours,
yeah, exactly, then they're having to go from managing that to hitting the pause button to talking to you to then making sure that they understand what you're trying to explain to them, to then think about it, to then give you an answer, to then have to then go back into the game. And like we said earlier on as well, GMs, DMs can be overloaded if you have 1,000 questions to ask. And again, if you're a new player, then it's difficult to work out what the important one is out of that bunch of questions. But stick to one or two, get the answers, then sit in that for a bit, figure out how that relates and what it means for the game, and then however far down the line, whether it's that same game or whether it's a game at some point in the future, whether it's out a game, ask another couple and then sit on them and just gradually work your way through everything. And again, remember what we said at the start, your short-term memory can only take 7 things plus or minus 2, so keep it small, think about it, get it in your long-term memory, understand it, know how you're using it, and then move on to the next lot of things. And remember that you will gain experience just through playing, and that's the best way to gain experience. But the reason as well I'm saying about asking like 2 or 3 things at any given time, there's actually try to physically remember whatever it is you're asking, but also if you are part of a large group, like Jordan saying that he's going to have 9 players turning up soon, then
less than 24 hours from now, Jamie, I'll have them all. Actually, they'll probably all be drunk by this point.
Yeah, exactly. Preparation is key. So if you've got 9 players, as an example, at your table, and they've all then got 2 or 3 questions, then that DM has got like 27 things to work their way through and to answer, that some might need a lot of thinking, some might not, but the long and the short is they've got a lot of time taken up just by a small amount of things. So be kind to your DMs, because they're the people that decide whether you live or die. So
but you guys have learned the hard way.
Yes, we have.
I've been the instrument of death twice now.
But
I mean, I think that's the main thing, to be honest. A lot of time it's not that bad, and it comes if you've got things that you want to figure out. Like, what's nice about having experienced players is I could have maybe asked. I was asking about the whole using my rage to get exhaustion. That's something the DM needs to clear. But if it was something about my character, or I spoke to Jamie that night about something about his character to double check a class feature, because I was getting mixed up between sorcerer and wizards, particularly the sorcerer points for anyone that's interested. Because I thought Wizards had something similar, so I just said to the guys, "You just keep going, and Jamie, I'll phone you, and we'll mute ourselves and roll 20." We got that sorted, and it was fine. When it came time, it was actually before the combat started. I knew going in I wanted to use my rage, so I just said before combat started, I got that approved, because that's before all the chaos starts to happen. And certainly, like, if you are a DM and you find yourself frequently overwhelmed with kind of people's suggestions, it is hard, and I still have problems with it, especially when people are drunk. Like, where they interrupt all the time. I usually just kind of defer their question until I'm dealing with whatever they're doing. If it's during combat, for example, if they've got a question, I'm just like, I'll get to you in a minute. I'll get around to them. I'll say it very nicely, and I'll get around to them and then ask them, what was the question again? And if they forgot, that's their fault. It wasn't important enough, and then that's fine. But it's worth just keeping that in mind. It can be a lot. Like, I'm used to running for like 6-7 people now. So what's 2 or 3 more? I'm probably going to regret saying that tomorrow. But
an increase of 50%.
Anything they say, they just go, I just say, yeah, whatever, and just ignore it. And just let it happen, and then everyone complains because they've got max damage. But yeah, it's just, that's it. Just keep it, just be sensible. That's really the whole point. And if you just communicate and just look after each other, and like, if you make sure you're just being respectful to the GM and not interrupting them every 3 seconds for questions and things, you'll be fine. If you've got issues with the game because you're confused, just say that to them at points where maybe it's pausing, or like a good time for all that's if the guy says, what are you going to do, then you can say, I don't know what the hell's going on. And then at least they can reiterate. They might not like it, but
and again, in that example where Jordan and myself muted and then quickly phoned each other and then clarified what we had to with each other's character, even though we're both relatively experienced players, we still needed that moment of clarification. So rather than completely pausing the game to then talk to the DM for Jordan to then get his stuff ticked off, for me to then talk to him to get his stuff ticked off, we both knew that we had the information that each other needed. So we went, right, we'll take 2 seconds to explain what we're doing so that nobody gets confused why, we're both muted but we're both like talking and nothing's happening, nothing's coming out. So just to remove any confusion, and then went on, done that, and then came back in. But in the meantime, while we were doing that, the other player that was there was then talking to the DM, and they were working through what they wanted to do. So by the time that we came back,
I think it was the middle of combat, so they actually got a whole
they got their turn.
They got a proper full turn. Well, what we had was a small thing, but because you're online, you can't do that on the same call because only one person can speak. So we managed to figure out a few things with each other's character, and I dumped all this crap on Jamie with my guy, just dumping it in text. Take this, like, huge walls, like, this is all the cool stuff you can do, make sure you use them because it makes them super strong.
I'm not sure if we ended up in the DM's bad books for that one, because I think the point of that was to kind of put us behind the 8 ball and introduce a bit of stress for the two of us, and we kind of went, right, we're just going to talk to each other, bye. I explained it.
Well, my
do this.
I'd said to them that what my question was, and I just said to them I was just clarifying what the hell an arcane tradition or whatever it is, because you get, basically, wizards get spell slots back and short rests, even though they don't get all of them, which is what was supposed to happen.
Arcane recovery.
Yeah, that's it. And sorcerers get sorcery points where they can convert those into spell slots as a bonus action or something. So I thought Wizards had something similar they could do. It turns out they can't. It's just a short rest thing. And it worked out because we won and nobody died. So hooray. Yay. Hooray to us. And we got a level up because I basically forced the guy. I said, look, I think that deserves a level up. And I don't know. We've never leveled up that quick.
I haven't.
Ever.
I haven't killed one of the other player characters. Can I not level up because I've shown restraint?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. We've not leveled up that quick ever. It's only been like 3 games, I think, since I leveled up.
Yeah.
And before that, it was like 4 months of games. Like, not even exaggerating. So I'm glad I asked. Now you guys are level 9, 8, and I'm level 9, I think.
Yeah.
Although it should really be 9, but we can bring that up and not overload the guy and bring it up next time.
Yeah.
But okay, I think that's really everything from me then in terms of this subject. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
I don't really think I've got anything else to add. Just if in doubt, trim it down, I think is the best way to avoid overload. And again, try your best to remember what it was like as a new player if you're an experienced player, and if you're a new player, just remember that if everybody there is new, don't worry, everybody's as confused as you are. And if you're playing with experienced players, then don't worry, they'll all understand. I think other than that, not really. And again, just reiterating that your short-term memory is probably a lot smaller than what you think it is, so that ties in with keeping everything lean, and again, just introducing rules as you need them and explaining them as and when they're there and relevant to do so.
Yeah, I think with that then, really for me, I would just love to hear what anyone listening or watching has to say about this subject. Anything that might have, if you think something we've said silly, or you've seen what we're talking about in person, or you've got a different opinion on it, we'd love to just hear it, because this is just our take on it really from this conversation alone. It's not like we've sat and prepped a script or anything, you know, we're just having this conversation live really.
And I think it's maybe worthwhile pointing that out for anybody who's made it this far and hasn't spotted this yet, but like Jordan's saying, there isn't a script. We don't sit and talk to each other about what we're going to talk about before we actually start talking. It's literally just a case of like we'll talk to each other, we'll be talking in general, and a topic will pop up, and then it'll just kind of scratch that bit of curiosity that's there, and then we'll go, right, okay, well, let's stop talking about this just now, let's park it, and then when we've got time to sit down and record something, then we'll work our way through it. And again, we've got the screens there, and you might see us looking down every so often, but all that's there is literally just a wee set of bullet points that's just
we'll get our own little notes to talk about. So that's the thing. We'd love to kind of have that conversation with yourself and whatever platform you decide to put that on, whether it's Facebook, YouTube, Discord, whatever else we've got so much now I can't remember, but
Instagram, you know, if you want to be different.
Is there any other social media platforms I'm missing?
Twitter, that's a thing that we've got. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Discord, YouTube comments. That's pretty much everything.
If you can hit us on the socials then, or on any of the platforms I've got, but if you also are watching this, or if you're on any of the podcast platforms, give it a wee like or a follow, whatever it is you've got on that particular platform. For YouTube, hit us with that like, maybe drop a comment with what you've got, or hit that bell if you want to see which stuff are coming out. We'd love you to give us any recommendations for topics if you want us to cover something in particular, and we're totally up for seeing some of that as well. So if you've got any ideas, let us know and we'd be happy to oblige. So I think from me, thanks very much for watching.
Thanks for staying on this far if you've managed to, and we'll see you next time.
See you.